The story began on a peaceful night. After the soccer match, my husband returned home accompanied by two friends. However, the experience of that night, returning home with two strangers, would change my perspective permanently. What was the unexpected event that left everyone stunned that night? In this literary work, we will find the answer to that question. Tranquility has always been one of my husband's distinguishing qualities. No surprises, no exaggerations. It was something predictable. He was one of those who choose to follow a stable routine rather than venture into risky situations. Our relationship was very close. From my perspective, it was that way. After so much time together, he never showed signs of hiding any secrets. In life, there are no definitive truths. Our coexistence was quite simple. During the day, I attended to my obligations and maintained my personal daily routine. At night, we used to relax, share dinner, enjoy the television, and occasionally chat with friends, though we didn't usually do that. In summary, the coexistence we enjoyed was harmonious, without ups and downs. On the night in question, he finally made his appearance online with the usual custom. The past weekend, my husband went to practice soccer. Every weekend, he carried out this task with dedication. That moment was perfect for resting and disconnecting. The time you share with your friends is priceless. Meanwhile, at that precise moment, I was at home updating my belongings. However, when he returned at night, he was not alone. Andres and Ramon are friends who are never apart. Two friends who had never met before. My beloved husband had company, showing a wide smile on his face. As I tried to remember if he had ever talked about them, the two met. No, I hadn't been able to do so until now. They seemed quite ordinary, while still maintaining a friendly attitude. However, there was something in the atmosphere that drew visual attention. At that precise moment, it was impossible for me to identify that emotion inside the home. It wasn't common to receive visits in that way. After the soccer match. Before, my husband wasn't accustomed to welcoming his friends into our house, though it seemed unusual to me. I chose to remain silent. I greeted everyone who was there. We maintained a cordial conversation. After that moment, I chose to step away to continue with my responsibilities. Exactly. I found myself needing to take care of that matter. Unbeknownst to me, I felt a strong longing for closeness, as if I were completely sure that that night would be unrepeatable. The evening began in the same way as on previous occasions. However, what would happen afterward would make me doubt not only the relationship I maintain. An evaluation of all my knowledge about my husband and myself would be my focus. Additionally, I would like to test my own assumptions after having prepared some drinks for my work colleagues. Upon returning to the room, the energy my husband radiated seemed like a mystery to me. Basically, I thought my excitement stemmed only from the prospect of spending time with Andres and Ramon, those colleagues I'd never had contact with before. I took a seat next to him on the sofa while they shared a pleasant moment and chatted about soccer, private jokes, and everyday topics. Everything indicated that everything was completely in order. In fact, up to that point, that night had no element that made it stand out. From time to time, I participated in the chat with a brief remark. However, something unusual caught my interest. My husband's singular personality was truly exceptional. I'm not sure if it was his attitude or the way he developed the conversation that generated uncertainty. However, there was something that didn't quite fit. Perhaps his face was what distinguished him. From time to time, our gazes met directly, as if he were waiting with great excitement for something special. However, I decided to ignore that. Maybe he was just in a good mood. Everything looked absolutely common up to that point. Suddenly, my husband's words generated a complete change in the atmosphere. Suddenly, he turned his eyes toward Ramon. A big smile lit up his face as his words resonated immediately in the depths of my being. The first name that comes to mind is Ramon. Are you aware that your partner could make your wish come true tonight? At that precise moment, I experienced the impression that suddenly everything came to a complete stop. Suddenly, everything plunged into silence, without a trace of laughter or noises. The words floated in the air like a dense fog, suspended in the air, unable to become invisible. I tried to mentally process the newly acquired information. Could you tell me what exact message you just conveyed? Are you joking with me? Why did you mention it? His communication was being carried out formally. I directed my gaze toward my husband, searching for some sign that it was all just a joke. Maybe he was about to burst out laughing at any moment. It's important to highlight that all this was part of an incoherent conversation. However, as for the numbers, one could clearly notice the serenity on his face. It could be considered equitable, with total confidence in his statements. No laughter was heard. No sound was heard. He looked intently, as if waiting for him to reply. I paid attention to the people accompanying my partner, trying to figure out if they were aware of what was happening. Ramon, an individual named Ramon, a person with outstanding talents, to whom the message had been conveyed unequivocally. He was completely disoriented. He remained motionless while the glass swayed from the table to his lips, as if he had suddenly lost the ability to move. On the other hand, Andres showed no emotions of any kind. His attention was completely focused on the floor, as if he wanted to disappear at that precise instant. In just a few moments, the atmosphere underwent a radical change. It was inevitable not to notice the evident influence of the atmospheric pressure. I couldn't discern if I was annoyed, confused, or perhaps scared. My thoughts wouldn't stop spinning in search of a rational explanation for what had just occurred. What was the reason behind his statement? What is the purpose of all this? We're talking about a game in this case. What do you expect from my performance? There were many unknowns that still had no answers. However, no answer was found. At the precise instant when I thought the situation couldn't be stranger. Upon pronouncing those words calmly, my husband added something that increased the tension in the environment. That's right. I'm communicating more seriously. That statement, with its clear and direct simplicity, delivered an intense blow to the abdominal region. The situation was not something to be taken lightly. After letting out a laugh, there was no hidden plan. He maintained the conversation with total commitment. The most disturbing thing of all was that I had no idea what it meant. Things didn't go as planned. The absence of noises in the room caused discomfort. No one dared to say a single word. Ramon remained firm without yielding. Andres couldn't look away in the opposite direction. The same for me. I remained in that location, simply in a seated posture trying to understand the situation. However, I was completely convinced. That night transformed into something unusual. From that comment onward, the situation underwent a total change. The perception my spouse generates in me, my bond with him, even my self-perception has undergone changes. Nevertheless, the night took an unexpected turn for all of us. He struggled to express himself precisely. My husband had always shown himself to be a discreet person, someone who usually avoided uncomfortable or unusual situations. Consequently, what was the reason for carrying this out at this specific moment? What led you to express those words in front of two individuals you just met? All aspects of my being made me feel that something wasn't going as it should. It lacked any sense. I examined the expression in his eyes closely, searching for some clue. I need an indication to help me understand the situation more clearly. However, he showed a total lack of interest. He tried to keep her in a state of calm, as if everything were in place. For a brief moment, I experienced an intense loneliness that completely invaded me, as if I were the only one present in that place, although there were 4 people in the group. My head was full of thoughts. In succession, neglecting the opportunity to reflect on them properly, we found ourselves faced with a tasteless joke. Are you trying something new? Do you feel resentment toward me? What do you expect from what I do? My mind wouldn't stop spinning rapidly. However, I experienced an intense shiver running through my entire being without the ability to move. Inside me burned an intense longing to stand up and escape quickly. Please proceed to change the room. Behave as if this situation isn't happening. I chose not to participate in something I didn't understand in the slightest. However, inside me there was an aspect I couldn't ignore. A small voice kept in a corner of my brain. It told me frequently, "Stay right here. Watch what's happening. Discover the reason hidden behind his actions." My longing to discover clashed with my instinct to escape. I decided to pay attention to my husband. He held his drink calmly, showing full acceptance of the circumstance. On his countenance, one could perceive something. The way he looks at you has something special and unique. What worried me most showed full confidence that everything would proceed favorably, as if he had anticipated the outcome of the evening. However, how could he be so convinced of such a thing? What was the purpose he was trying to show? And it wasn't just him. The two individuals caught my interest as I investigated what they communicated in search of signs of their mutual uncertainty. Ramon remained firm, acting as if he hadn't decided between bursting into laughter or fleeing. Andres seemed uncomfortable. However, his position gave me the impression that he was eagerly awaiting what would happen next. What is his expectation? What would be the best measure for me to implement? With arms crossed, it was hard for me to stay calm. I wasn't thinking of giving up so soon. I didn't want to give the impression that I was confused. The situation could worsen considerably. Lacking strength, I decided to remain silent, acting as if I had no relation to the events. Pretend that it doesn't affect me at all. However, inside the house, the situation was plunged into complete disorder. Once again, my husband looked at me intently. On this occasion, his perspective had completely changed. It wasn't something that caught the interest. The situation was not something to be taken lightly. He showed certain confidence in my abilities, something I couldn't fully understand. What idea were they considering? What were my goals and desires? At that precise moment, that was the only thing I could understand. Despite my effort to resist with all my energy, I had already given my consent to be part of whatever plan he was organizing. It was impossible to leave the job. I experienced the sensation of being trapped in an intermediate state. Doubts continued to torment me relentlessly in my mind. However, the climatic situation was gradually worsening. The peaceful noise coming from the sky resonated softly through the leaves, just like the tick-tock of clocks counting the seconds. To begin with, the breathing that touches me becomes increasingly difficult to manage. I wish to receive solutions to the questions I have. However, I couldn't decide to investigate. My cell phone continued to resist completely. Next, I present it to you. He was the one responsible for carrying out that task. I was surprised by the calm he showed. Calmly, the husband stood up from the chair. He didn't make a single sound. He neglected his friends. He remained completely still. He approached me with his calm step, making decisions with total confidence about the path to take. Upon getting close, he leaned in slightly and whispered something in my ear, at such a low volume that it was imperceptible to the others. Trust my skill. I expressed my thoughts out loud. Those 3 words only. However, it managed to stop the whirlwind of thoughts swirling in my head. Calmness was clearly reflected in his way of speaking, almost protective. However, making a resolution on the spot, providing instructions delicately, as if it were a kind request. At that precise moment, I lived a mixture of emotions that was complicated to describe verbally. To begin with, I thought about the idea of clearly asking him to stop joking with me. It is essential that he explain immediately the situation that was taking place. However, the way he looks at you has something special and unique. The demonstration I witnessed led me to meditate. The feeling of protection I felt took me by surprise. He had never shown impulsive behaviors. He was carrying out this task. It is essential to have a valid justification. Although I still couldn't understand it, the words he said to me continued to echo in my mind. You must trust my abilities and what I can achieve. The situation was starting to complicate. It really is a true challenge. However, for some reason, I found myself in a situation where I had no other options available. It seemed that that message was being transmitted to me, even if it's unusual or uncomfortable. All this had a cause. Although I didn't have an exact knowledge of its meaning, I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. Surrounded by the back of the armchair, I took a deep breath. I had no intention of leaving hastily. I had no intention of continuing to resist. At that precise moment, I decided to follow the advice of others. What is the reason for that? Even if I don't understand the situation, I was interested in discovering how far this could go. Inside me, I longed to trust him fully. Barely an insignificant whisper. Those 3 sentences have reached a point from which there is no turning back. Ignoring that, I began a process that would completely change the way I saw my husband and myself. In a brief moment, I remained motionless. I kept my eyes fixed on my husband. My head wouldn't stop searching for solutions. However, at that moment, I also noticed that, without realizing it, I had reached a point where I could no longer go back. Upon leaving, I felt a sensation. I would be unable to resolve the situation in any way. It wouldn't be as simple as it seems. However, this would have broader consequences. I no longer understood the dynamic that was forming between us. Right at that instant, I chose to stay. For a brief moment, I remained motionless. I kept my gaze fixed on my husband. My head wouldn't stop searching for solutions. However, at that moment, I also noticed that without realizing it, I had reached a point from which there was no turning back. I had the sensation that something would happen if I left. I wouldn't have the capacity to resolve the situation. It's not just that. It wouldn't only acquire greater depth of meaning, but it would also carry greater importance. I no longer understood the situation between the two of us. Right at that instant, I chose to stay after a long period of time. Finally, the awaited moment arrived. I experienced the emotion of contemplating it from a completely different perspective. Could you help me identify that person, please? For a long time, that person had been by my side. However, in some way, at that precise moment, the perspective of the situation was another. I experienced a feeling of protection totally unknown. The sense of security I was experiencing at that moment was very attractive to me. It's unsettling. I decided to stay. It doesn't limit itself to finding out his intentions, but goes beyond. In the same way, for the purpose of understanding the identity of this person. It seems, according to what is observed, there were unknowns that I still couldn't resolve. He was faced with a puzzle that needed solving, something that couldn't be left unmentioned. Although the concern continued present at that precise moment, a great curiosity completely invaded him. At that precise moment, I chose to make a decision that would completely change the circumstance. He had crossed the limit. From that instant onward, everything that happened would be taken into account. Going back in time is not available. As the night progressed, gradually, everything began to change. My husband, with his typical disconcerting calm, continued expressing unusual observations. At first glance, the phrases didn't seem threatening at all. However, they always showed a duality of meanings. Something that made you question if there was something hidden behind this circumstance. Andres and Ramon, two friends who are always together. A friendship that cannot be broken. At first, a tense and inflexible posture was noticeable in their behavior. They began to calm down. Although not completely, they tried to adjust to an environment that was difficult for them to fully understand. From my point of view, feelings piled up inside them. It turned uncertainty into a feeling of unease. Subsequently, a concern arose in me that was impossible to ignore. What reason has driven the execution of this action? I always asked myself the same unknown. What is the purpose of his investigation? Are you trying something new? Maybe his only pleasure is to have fun with games. In my head, the uncertainties kept adding up. As time passed, the answers seemed to move further and further away. The name Andres possesses. Which of the two friends was usually more discreet when speaking? Finally, the moment arrived. He interrupted the quiet with a faint laugh. Of course, in my opinion, this situation is a bit annoying. Do you agree, right? While contemplating my husband. He made a statement on the other hand. Ramon tried to change the subject by mentioning soccer. However, with a simple wave of his hand, my husband stopped the action, acting as if he were maintaining control of the conversation. Let's keep the topic without changes, showing an unkind facial expression. My husband expressed his opinion. I'd like to talk about a topic that interests me much more. I want all those present to show total sincerity. Once again, a deep silence invaded the room upon hearing what he said. Both friends looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable, while I felt my heart rate increase. Of course. Is this what you had in mind? What kind of honesty are you seeking to find? I bit my lip, hurting myself, trying to stay calm. However, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly strange. It seemed like we were part of a social experiment. At that moment, we were all participating in an activity in which only my partner was allowed to participate. Tell me what's going on. The name that comes to mind is Ramon. My husband continued showing interest in that person. What was your reaction when you saw your wife for the first time tonight? Ramon didn't want to let go of his drink, clearly impacted by the unexpected situation that arose. He looked at his husband. After that, it was I who ended up falling in the end. Lean down. Are you sure you want me to name it? When formulating the question, his nervousness and lack of precision were evident. Yes. I want you to express yourself with total honesty. Undoubtedly, it was my husband who replied. The calm that his smile conveyed generated a certain unease in me. While waiting for Ramon's response, I felt the tension take hold of my entire being. It seemed that suddenly the passage of time had stopped. It always felt endless. I never imagined I was questioning my husband in that way. However, I was convinced that any comment from Ramon was going to disturb the atmosphere of the night. After taking a deep breath, Ramon gave his answer. Her beauty impressed me. She seemed like a truly beautiful woman. The lack of confidence in his verbal expression was evident, as if he were about to be reprimanded. The husband nodded in approval, as if he had foreseen that response exactly. After that moment, he turned his eyes toward Andres. How are you? My name is Andres. What thoughts came to your mind? The name Andres possesses. Clearly irritated. He tried to draw a smile to calm the tension felt at that moment. I think we're in sync. He showed disinterest by shrugging his shoulders. I began to feel a tranquility noticeable in my facial expression. There were some doubts about whether I was experiencing shame, discomfort, or any additional bodily sensation. However, every word worsened the atmosphere. I wanted to communicate something, anything, with the purpose of stopping the conversation. However, my curiosity persisted. What would the perspectives be for my husband with this opportunity in terms of his reach? What was the intention behind asking these questions? Great tension was noticeable in the environment. However, from that instant, my husband's behavior radically changed the situation. Suddenly, he stood up from his seat. He placed the glass on the table with such precision that it seemed premeditated. The accommodation. In past times, the environment was dominated by an uncomfortable silence. At this precise moment, the situation was totally still, as if the passage of time had stopped entirely. Every time he approached the center of the room, his steps echoed like an echo, as if the passage of time had stopped entirely. At that precise moment, everyone had their eyes on him. Even I, up to that instant, was facing an internal struggle against my own thoughts. It was impossible to avoid the intense scrutiny of his gaze. In that specific place, something was present, the way he looked at each of us. At that instant, I realized he was about to choose something of great proportions. I began to notice how my heart was beating more intensely. A mixture of excitement and fear invaded my mind. What is he about to communicate? I have some doubts that are generating insecurity. In this way, it became clear with his calm and expressing himself verbally, almost as if they maintained a friendship. First, he looked at Andres and then turned toward Ramon. I need assistance during the night. He expressed his opinion, altering the tranquility like a sharp blade. I would like to have your trust. I have total confidence in your ability, just as you trust in me. Both he and she looked at him with evident bewilderment, while I remained motionless trying to assimilate what I had just heard. Andres was the pioneer in making a statement. He emitted a delicate noise, almost like a barely audible whisper. Could you indicate the translation of that phrase, please? Upon showing his security and nervousness, he made it clear when asking the question. He replied to his husband with a big smile on his face, a smile that gradually revealed more intense emotions inside him. On this particular night, disguises are not used. Secrets lack tangible reality. I want all individuals on this platform to be completely sincere, even if it causes them discomfort. I felt pressure in the chest area. What firm stance do you have on the topic? I took it into account. Would you be so kind as to detail more precisely what you are referring to exactly? What is your prognosis for what will happen in this location? Inside my mind, I considered other options. However, all I found were more questions. The atmosphere was charged, with a tension so palpable that it could be felt in the environment surrounding us, like a load that all of us had to bear. I focused Andres' attention on Ramon, trying to understand what his thoughts were. However, they looked as confused as I was. my husband, as if he had noticed that he needed an additional stimulus, directed his gaze toward his location. There's no reason to be uneasy. It's not about writing an essay. A calm expression lit up his face with a smile. My greatest desire is that the two of us can support each other. After referencing that aspect, he directed his gaze toward me. The strength of his visual expression was evident, as if you were at the epicenter of everything. At that moment, I realized that something had progressed. He wasn't content with being just a spectator. At this very moment, he was completely dedicated to the task, despite not having total certainty about the exact way. Right at that instant, my husband chose to completely change the way we spend our nights. He approached Andres with the intention of conveying certain news to him. I experienced a calm that almost made my skin crawl. The individual is named Andres. If you decide to trust me fully, of course, please carry out the request I've made to you. Head toward that individual. My pupils dilated noticeably. Consider the objects as if they were plates of food. I noticed that I began to inhale and exhale more rapidly. What activity is he currently engaged in? I've been reflecting deeply, while Andres looked at him with eyes full of desire for something that seemed out of reach. Ramon couldn't hide his nervousness. The same for me. My mind was in a constant dilemma between uncertainty and curiosity. My entire being was in a state of alertness. However, I couldn't move or make any sound. The atmospheric pressure was unbearable. Andres demonstrated a lack of clarity in expressing himself. First, he turned his attention toward my husband and then toward me. After taking a deep breath, he gradually integrated, taking note of every activity he carries out. He approached where I was. However, after that, he made a brief pause. He turned toward Ramon, waiting for his approval with his gaze. My husband remained silent for an instant. His calm countenance was beginning to disturb those around him. He demonstrated understanding of the situation. In the end, they would take care of attending to his requests. Right at that moment, I had the impression that everything was on the verge of collapse. Andres was about to do something that none of us fully understood. Ramon seemed about to take action. In contrast, my husband only limited himself to observing as if everything was developing according to his precise calculations. It was at that exact instant when I realized. Last night, I was about to reach a point from which there was no return. The atmosphere inside the room was unusual. Andres had approached where I was. However, he decided to take a break. Thinking about the situation, Ramon remained motionless with the glass in his hand. However, my focus was on the group we belonged to, in the exploration of a specific permission, as if it were necessary to obtain authorization. Some signals. In contrast, my husband remained firm and calm, acting as if he knew what would happen next. The environment was so charged that it was difficult to breathe normally. We felt that the air weighed too much. In this way, my husband headed toward the front, maintaining the calm he had demonstrated throughout the night. He expressed something that made it clear that this circumstance far exceeded our expectations. On this night, the key doesn't lie only in the use of concrete terms. He expressed his opinion firmly. The key is in believing in oneself, leaving behind our fears, and throwing ourselves into experiencing something we wouldn't normally dare to try. When the gaze of both crossed, Andres and Ramon provoked a chilling sensation that ran down my back. His statements left no room for doubt. Last night, I reflected on crossing limits I had never surpassed before. A slight tremor ran through my hands. I felt my heart beating so hard that it seemed everyone around me could hear it. He showed doubts about his ability to face the situation. However, upon meeting my husband's gaze, there was something in his face that led me to take a deep breath. My word is trustworthy. Once again, he spoke to me in a low voice. That simple sentence seemed to have the power to clear all my doubts. After a thorough examination, I proceeded to review it. I agreed with that thought. In this way, a complete change occurred in all aspects. The dense atmosphere saturating the room began to transform into something completely new. An environment full of feelings with a gaze full of emotion from a first encounter that was extremely fascinating. However, he soon demonstrated more bravery. I felt the touch of my husband's hands caressing my shoulders, approaching gently, while Andres and Ramon drew closer little by little, as if awaiting an invitation that had already been sent to them. At first, the situation became a bit embarrassing, practically without interruption, as if we were venturing into unexplored and totally foreign territory. United all together, however, gradually, the obstacles began to be eliminated. The eyes reflected greater intensity, gestures full of confidence. My husband took charge of the control, maintaining precision to the rhythm, while the rest advanced. Little by little, the uncertainty dissipated. I had never experienced anything like it. I experienced a feeling of total fragility. However, it has no tendency toward that. Suddenly, I found myself with a door that seemed to have been there all along. However, opening it always seemed difficult for me. Andres placed his hands around my waist, the delicate touch of his fingers, while Ramon remained nearby with an expression mixing unease and longing on his face. The intensity enveloped everything completely. It's truly overwhelming. However, immediately it becomes truly liberating. My beloved husband. His gaze didn't leave me. On his face was a mixture of happiness and contentment. He observed how everything fit perfectly with what was planned. As the night progressed, the barriers separating us disappeared completely. Shame had no place, simply to evoke moments from the past. Reliability and the bond was an experience completely different from everything I had lived before. I experienced a situation that gave me a special and revitalizing energy. I know that my husband was also going through that same situation. From my point of view, the evaluation wasn't limited to an easy task. An evaluation was carried out that encompassed all those involved, a strategy to exceed our previous expectations. Upon finishing everything inside the room, tranquility returned. However, in this case, it wasn't a bother. A complete silence full of joy was perceived, absolute tranquility, understanding at a deeper level. Andres and Ramon sat comfortably on the sofa, sharing glances that expressed emotions transcending the possibilities of verbal language. On the contrary, my husband took my hand and looked at me as if he needed to make sure I was okay. That was how the circumstance presented itself exceptionally. I looked at him and nodded to show agreement, displaying a smile impossible to hide. Are you aware of that topic? While brushing a strand of hair from my face, he was questioned in absolute silence. Trust is the fundamental pillar in all kinds of circumstances, with the certainty that, regardless of the circumstances, we will maintain our union at all times. Although there was still a long analysis to be done, I have managed to understand the message he was trying to convey to me that night. It not only altered the dynamic between us, it also impacts the perception I have of my husband in relation to myself and everything we thought we understood about love and trust. That night, we crossed borders I never would have thought of crossing. However, what happened afterward completely transformed our relationship and our perception of the true importance of placing trust in another person. The experience I just lived will remain etched in my memory for a long time. That night, I experienced a change inside me. I watched as Andres and Ramon left the residence. I continue reflecting on what happened. I observed a change in the way I saw both my partner and myself. The situation turned out to be quite embarrassing. That's right, completely agree. However, it is essential. My husband approached my location, took my hands, and looked me straight in the eyes. Can you visualize it? Trust is essential in all kinds of circumstances, always displaying his distinctive serenity. He contacted me despite not having fully understood his emotions on that occasion. I was certain of having acquired significant knowledge. Trust goes beyond being simply an emotion. Carrying out this task requires demonstrating bravery. That night wasn't just a rehearsal. It showed us the opportunities that arise when overcoming the challenges that limit us. Sometimes it is necessary to leave the comfort zone to evolve and advance. On that night, despite the unpredictability of his character, a memory reached me that will remain in my mind eternally. Tell me, at this moment, in moments when you find yourself in a circumstance that demands total trust, faced with such a circumstance, what would your reaction be? From time to time, the answers we long for seem unattainable from our perspective. At the instant the door closed after Andres and Ramon left, the house was plunged into a deep silence. The nighttime energy could be felt in the air. For a fleeting instant, both decided to remain silent. I remained seated in the armchair, I continue reflecting on what happened, staying calm beside me, just as he had been throughout the night. My husband was about to sit down. "How are you?" with an expression combining concern and genuine interest. Fixing his gaze on my eyes, he questioned me intensely. I nodded calmly. However, I was fully aware that my face showed a combination of feelings. It's hard for me to communicate what I'm experiencing at this moment. Finally, the time arrived. Offer a response. The authenticity of the statement was confirmed. His mind was full of ideas, not knowing where to start. At that precise moment, the person who expressed himself was my spouse. My expectations for this night went beyond a mere evaluation. He expressed his thoughts with caution and attention. I would like us to understand a crucial aspect. By placing sincere trust, we have overcome fear. Having trust allows us to overcome the challenges we create. The words he pronounced began to take on meaning in every event of that night. At the beginning, it was inevitable not to experience some discomfort. Is there a possibility to communicate this information differently? I expressed my question with an annoyed tone. However, during our conversation, it was evident to me that what happened was inexplicable verbally. My husband was enthusiastic about the idea of living that experience by my side, experiencing that living in our personal emotions. At that precise moment, we would truly understand the genuine importance of trust. The dialogue gave us the opportunity to meditate on the experiences we have shared together. It was then that I realized it, despite the unusual and mysterious nature of the night, it also represented an occasion to develop and advance, not only in the romantic realm, but also individually, personally, from time to time. The experiences we least expect are the ones that have the greatest impact on our personal evolution. What would be your limit of trust in another person? It was on that night that I acquired fundamental knowledge. From time to time, the most surprising events motivate us to evolve and progress, improve the communication we maintain, and strengthen our bonds in unexpected ways. Trust goes beyond a simple explanation of words. It alludes to a specific task. It was during that night that I understood that exploring the uncertain can reveal your true essence. Faced with this circumstance, what actions would you take? Of course, include this information in the comments section. If you enjoyed the narration, remember to subscribe to access additional material that will inspire you to reflect.